Hello! In this video, we're looking at security standards. So we talked about security management before, and to implement that, we need to follow some security standards. And in particular, there are two items that I would like to introduce. One is ISO, and the other one is NIST. Okay, so in this particular video, we'll be looking at the ISO one first, and the next one you can look at the NIST one, and you can have a look at some comparisons. But basically, in the ISO 27000, it specifies the security standards there, and there are about 36 standards that outlines how you can implement security for your systems. Okay, this is widely used, but it's not a public standard that you can do. Okay, so you need to purchase it and implement it, and then you can get certified later. Alternatively, you can use the NIST security framework. This one is publicly available. It gets reviewed by governments and industry professionals quite regularly. For example, the standard SP800 specifies things like computer security handbook, as well as generally accepted security principles and practices and so forth. So this one we'll cover in the next video. So we'll look at the ISO first. Firstly, ISO management is outlined in 27001, 2, 3, and 7. Okay, so it's about the requirements, management, implementation guide, and guideline for information security management systems. Okay, for the NIST, there is a 14 for principles and practices for securing IT systems, and there's a couple of others. And in terms of the security measurement, measurement is very important for evaluating the security posture and risk assessment. ISO 27004 specifies the security management measurement aspect. For the NIST, it's the 55, the performance measurement guide for information security. Okay, and further, we have the security risk management. I will actually not read them out, but you can have a look at them, as well as the incident management. So what those standards do is provide like manuals and guidelines for you to follow to update your security posture. And further, what those international standards do is once you follow these procedures and satisfy those conditions, then they can certify you that, okay, this particular system now meets the ISO security standards. What that certification do is it tells that your system has gone through all those procedures and hurdles to implement the security measures needed to make it safe. Okay, what it means is it has those specified security solutions in the system. However, that does not guarantee that it's going to be attack proof. Okay, nevertheless, so the management process goes like this. We start with the policies and organizational aspects and all those stuff. So the first couple of lines we saw in the security management in the previous video, and then we input those into the risk analysis. Okay, and out of those, what we do is we use those information to conduct the risk assessment and understand the security posture. This gets passed on to the implementation phase, where you select some security solutions for implementation, as well as the awareness and training. And then we do the follow-up, and this falls into this cycle. Okay, so what you want to do is not just do a security practice once, but make sure that this is a continuous cycle, that you are continuously looking for threats, vulnerabilities, and addressing them as you go along. Okay, so why is this cycle needed? Well, if you think about this, a typical system includes many assets. Okay, so not just a small home network, but if you think about like an enterprise or larger size, even at university, we have a lot of different accounts, roles, systems, and so forth. There are a lot of different assets that we need to take care of. Okay, and because of the complexity and the size, it is quite infeasible to examine the risk of all the assets due to the limited resources and time. Okay, so this can be monetary, time, as well as expertise and so forth. Okay, So in order to provide the best security risk assessment approach, given the organization's resources, there are a few different practices that we can do. Firstly, the baseline is to use the industry best practice. So there are some guidelines on what people need to do and what not, and people will just follow that. However, this is quite limited, as this is only knowing what you can do to provide that really basis of the security. There are informal approaches, conducting informal, pragmatic, practical risk analysis, basically just doing your own testing and patching it as you go. There are formal approaches like assess the security risk using formal structured process. We'll talk a bit more about that later on. Okay? And also you can do combinations of those previous ones. As a recommendation, it is best to do combinations of all those approaches and make sure that you do them thoroughly. Okay? And what those security standards enables us to do is continuously revisit those so that we close the gap more iterations that we go through. Okay? So when we look at ISO 27001, it maps out the process that we need to go through to achieve the cycle that we saw before. Okay? And once you finish the certification, you're not necessarily finished. You can always revisit these tasks again and make improvements. But nevertheless, to get the certification, all you need to do is finish these 9 tasks. Okay? So the first one is to define information security policy. So when we talked about the security management, we were looking at collecting data, understanding about the system, and to produce some goals and requirements, right? So this is what's going to happen for the ISO first step. We want to define information security policy, where the person conducting this is to deliver policy documents, okay? So what are our security policies that the users must follow to ensure that the security can be provided in our system? Okay. We want to scope the ISMS, the Information Security Management System. So Information Security Management System, ISMS, will provide us a set of policies and procedures to follow. Okay. So as the second phase, based on the security policies, we can define the ISMS. Okay. And what this ISMS will do is provide an identification of threats that it can mitigate and security objectives that it will satisfy. Okay, so through the first 2 steps, what we're trying to gather is understand what are the threats, what are the policies, what are the goals, what are the requirements, and what are the assets. Okay, all those are incorporated into the first 2 steps in the ISO steps. Okay. And when we come to the third stage, we're going to perform risk assessment for scope of ISMS. Okay, so what we're going to do is collect data about the threats, the risk, the impacts, and vulnerabilities. And using this, we can create a risk assessment document. Okay, and what this risk assessment document tells us is about what are some of the things that we need to be focusing on, what kind of vulnerabilities can be exploited by what attacks, exploits, and how they can impact us in the system operations, and all of that linking back to the security policies that we set out in the first stage. Okay. So once we understand about our security posture, we can move on to the next step by identifying the risk management decision. Okay, so what are we going to do about the risks that we highlighted? Okay, so typically what you do here is to find out different ways that each risk can be mitigated, and it can be as simple as identifying security solutions for each risk, but also it can involve things like risk transfers and finding others who will be accountable for if that something can be exploited or compromised. So not only specifying how they can be mitigated, but also identifying accountabilities and responsibilities for the risks that has been found. Okay. So once we understand how those can be addressed, not necessarily or mitigated, but addressed in terms of including accountabilities and responsibilities, then we can look at selection of objectives and controls. So this is where we can look at, okay, what can we implement, what kind of security controls and solutions we can implement to minimize the risks that we identified earlier. Okay, so this controls and guideline is from the ISO 17799, but obviously any other controls that fit for the purpose can be applied here. And as a result, you have you produce the statement of applicability. This set out what are the things you're going to do in order to minimize the risk of the system. Okay, so this will also tells us details about what will be prioritized or what will be not, with an explanation, because as mentioned before, not all the assets can be protected and not all the vulnerabilities can be patched at once because due to the constraints. Okay, and those can be outlined and specified here, which can be revisited later to be patched. Okay, and then we move on to the control implementation. Make sure that the previous step outlined objectives and controls are implemented correctly. Okay, but you don't check whether they are working correctly here. You check it next. Okay, so what you do is you have a step of evaluating of all the steps that you have taken up to here and ensure that they are functioning correctly. So certification assessment ensures that all process steps are complete and identified risks are mitigated. So this is where you revisit your implementations and check that they are functioning and serving the purpose as they are first outlined to do. And you will only visit step 8 if there are any issues that has been found. So if you remember our first diagram, there's a cycle loop here where you can revisit stage 8 after stage 7 as many times as you need to ensure you can take corrective actions to address that. Okay, and finally, once that's all done, you can get the certification. Okay, and ideally this can be done in a short time frame, but typically this is quite a long time procedure. So on average, it can take many months for the whole cycle to complete, and as a result, it is quite tedious to do. However, if you do complete all of this procedure, you know that all the identified risks and as a result, the solutions you implemented will be able to secure your system much better than what you previously had. Okay. So that's the procedure of using the ISO security standard. We'll stop here. In the next one, we'll be looking at the NIST security standard and have a look at a little bit of comparison to the ISO. Okay, see ya.